More people are going to create their dream wildlife job in the next few years than they have in all of human history. Wildlife vacancies, those that are even advertised, that is, are absurdly competitive. If professional success for you means working with birds of prey, if you do what other successful people do, if you plan, if you set goals, if you just don't quit, you eventually get the job. The Practical Animal channel is a platform for interviews for the ambitious. It documents wildlife professionals' rise to success, providing a career roadmap. Watch this video for an excellent summary of what it takes to work with wild falcons. So, if career success for you means working with peregrine falcons, how do you get there? Dr Ed Drewitt is an ecologist specialising in the urbanisation of the British Peregrine Falcon. He studies all behavioural aspects of the species associated with this demographic shift, including nocturnal hunting. He is the author of Urban Peregrines, Bird Pellets, and Raptor Prey Remains. If you're learning English as a second language, this video will be useful because you will hear two British accents. And before we go any further, I would like to say thank you to my subscribers. Without you, there would be no channel. Working with birds of prey and living the wild life looks like this. Ed, what jobs are there with raptors?
Well, there's a real range of different jobs to do with raptors, really. I mean, for me personally, it's been about actually kind of a lot of TV work, actually, and public engagement, engaging people with peregrines and things like that. But actually, when you look across the range, there's everything from people who are kind of conservation officers looking after raptors in the wild. You've got investigation officers who work, for example, for the RSPB and alongside the police, investigating bird crime and raptor crime, for example. But then away from that, and away from the wild, you've also got the fact that there's many people all across the country who work in falconry, particularly you've got public coming to actually see falcons and hawks and eagles actually being flown, for example. Um, you've got vets, people who specialize in going beyond just your dogs and your cats and actually going into looking at things like wild birds and raptors. And also, of course, zookeepers as well. So that's slightly separate to kind of falconry, where you might have owls and hawks and falcons and things like that actually on display. So there's quite a wide range of different things. And of course, where I come from also, it's broadcasting. So actually, over the last 25 years, a lot of my relationship with the peregrine and actually professionally doing things with peregrines, for example, has actually been through media, through television and radio, particularly.
Hmm. And how do you get into that, presenting and working with the media?
Well, I think that the media side of it has very much been where, I mean, I was sort of based in Bristol a lot. I had a relationship that developed with, for example, Radio Bristol. And as ever with media, I think it's just about reputation. It's about locally getting a kind of name for yourself. When I think back to it 25 years ago now, a lot of it I think came from the fact that I was doing a project on peregrines, and I had some funding from Bristol Zoo, which was part of a Millennium Project back then in 2000. And part of the remit was to actually sort of meet people, go out to people, go out to schools, public. And I think through that, with kind of press releases and things like that, I kind of developed a relationship with kind of Talking Radio Bristol. But I think with a lot of these things that are all related to career, it's all about things that they take time to get to know people. It's opportunities where you get to go in and talk on radio or television about one thing and you get known for something else. But I think with Peregrines, particularly for me, it's just been about this incremental getting to know journalists, getting to know the stations. And so what happens then, of course, is you get a story and people then think, ah, Ed Drewitt's the person for that. And then quite often you get roped in to talk about other things as well, like urban goals, for example, or the other day I was talking on Radio Gloucestershire about red kites. So these things develop kind of over time.
What about the publishing world, Ed? Because you've written quite a few books, haven't you? How did you get into publishing?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So when I first started out in my 20s, like a lot of people, I really wanted to be an author. I really wanted to have the opportunity to publish a book. And I remember having a few, I think it's good to talk about the sort of the less positive side of it as well as the positive side of it. So to start with, I was speaking to other people that I knew who'd published books. I remember contacting a publisher and saying, look, I'm really interested in publishing a book. And those all led to dead ends, which I think is often the case for publishing, really. But my break came when I was actually speaking about peregrines with Yolo Williams on BBC's Spring Watch. And I was in Bath and I was talking about peregrines. And out of the blue, I kind of basically got an email from a publishing company called Pelagic, who said, "We know we've seen you on television. We'd love you to write a book about urban peregrines." And that's how it came about. And so I liaised with them. And I guess because I had that clout, because I was talking on Springwatch as a kind of peregrine expert, really, they could see that I was an appropriate person to approach and ask, if I could do this. And a lot of my background has been in public engagement as well and kind of explaining things in plain English. So, all these things I guess are great when it comes to writing a book about urban peregrines that everybody understands. So that was my break really. So I did that back in 2014. And the thing with studying peregrines is that I've looked at what they eat. And so that involves often finding their remains of their food and what have you. So that then led to another book on raptor prey remains. And so Pelagic Publishing tend to focus a lot of their effort on more niche books that appeal to still quite a wide range of people, but with a kind of narrow interest, as it were, really. So I then did one on raptor prey remains, which is all about the kind of first things that you find on your lawn. For example, when a sparrowhawk's been feeding on a collared dove or a greenfinch or something like that. And it was the kind of first things that I know that you tend to find. And then most recently, again through Pelagic, I've published a book on pellets, owl pellets. So I think for me, it's been about actually, rather than having a general knowledge about wildlife, which I do have, which is how a lot of authors might publish wildlife books, it's actually been by having a very specific niche interest in something, like raptor prey remains, like peregrines, like pellets, that's actually allowed me, in my case, to become a publisher. Sorry, become a published author.
That's brilliant. And the Urban Peregrines book that you've written, Ed, published by
Yeah.
Pelagic, what's the audience for that?
So that the audience for peregrines specifically is members of the public, as well as people who might well be studying peregrines, but not necessarily people who are doing, say, a PhD or a master's on them, although it is equally interesting for them. But across the country, there are a lot of what I call peregrine champions. These are people who love their local peregrines. They're very good at kind of making sure that they're protected. They might well have set up a web camera, for example. So it's for people who have a general interest in peregrines, who perhaps are studying them in more detail, but not necessarily academically. But the Urban Peregrine book is also just for members of the public that want to find out a little bit more about them. So I've tried to write it in a way where it's still scientific, but it's written kind of in plain English so that anybody can pick it up,
Mm,
understand it as well.
mm, mm.
And the reason I wrote it really was because, as well as being approached, was that there was quite a lot of scientific information about peregrines hidden away in journals that many of them were behind paywalls and things like that. So I wanted to kind of bring that information out into the public domain so that anybody could read about peregrines without having to go through an academic route, basically.
It's fascinating. It really is. How can somebody get a signed copy of your book, Ed?
Well, if they want a signed copy, they can contact me direct and I can, sort out payment and get one signed. But there are sometimes outlets. So if I'm giving talks on peregrines, I might well have books with me. And for example, this Sunday actually coming up, I'm giving a talk, for example, at the Clifton Literacy Festival. So I do lots of things that are where I'm meeting people and seeing people, and people can get the chance to have it signed personally as well.
Mhm. Do you do public speeches and talks all over the country, Ed?
Well, I used to, yeah, I tend to be a bit more local now. I've got young children, 5 and 8, so I generally tend to do Zoom talks on peregrines if it's something in another part of the country, which is brilliant because it means I can reach people that I wouldn't have otherwise have reached previously. But you still can't beat doing things in person. So, in a couple of weeks' time, I'm talking to the Cheltenham Bird Club, for example. Next week, I'm going to Bath RSPB group. So I still do things in person, and it's nice to meet real people and do things in person. But I'm also able to get a wider reach. For example, last year I gave a talk to a local wildlife trust in Suffolk, and Suffolk's just a long, long way for me to get to from Gloucestershire, particularly if you're just doing a night's talk. So it's really nice now to have that reach both through something like an online presentation, but then still meeting people more locally in person. And I think, it's really good to have that develop those skills where you can do both. You can be really engaging to an audience online, which is more tricky because you haven't got those initial kind of responses from people. You're not seeing if people are laughing, you're not seeing how they're responding, but equally having the skills to be able to present to an audience in person where they're there in front of you and you're talking immediately to them practically.
Mm, mm, mm. Fantastic. And for somebody watching this, Ed, is really, really, has been really, what you do has caught their imagination. Succinctly put, what do you do?
So I study peregrine falcons, particularly those that live in urban locations, and I look at what they eat. I look at their diet.
Ed, do you do it for personal satisfaction, professional recognition, or the money?
Well, I started off studying peregrines totally voluntary, totally because I was curious about seeing these what back 25 years ago, 30 years ago were still very rare birds and having the chance to find out what they eat. Um, the publicity side of it, the broadcasting side of it, is kind of has come along with it and has given me, reasonable kind of income with it as well. But I would always say that that's always been an aside. I'd say that my motivation has always been this kind of personal fascination with peregrines and what they eat. And so at the moment, I'm just completing a PhD, for example, in my kind of mid 40s because, I wanted to, all this data I've collected over the last 2 decades, I wanted to, crunch and get out there into the public domain and kind of feel that I was doing something useful with it. So the professional side of it has always been a very nice to have. But I'd say the initial motivation has always been this kind of voluntary curiosity with peregrines as an ornithologist, really.
Clearly, we've touched on it already, Ed, but sequentially, how did your career develop?
Well, I went to university at Bristol, and back then in the late 90s, peregrines were still pretty rare. And I learned that literally down the road from where I was studying, there were peregrines, there were urban peregrines. So I linked up with a local ornithologist who'd been studying them. He took me to show them. I realized that they were feeding on things that were really interesting. And as a kid, I used to collect skulls and feathers of birds. And so the peregrines were feeding on things I didn't have in my collection. So I was both fascinated by the peregrines and what they were eating and things that I could get into my collection. And the more that I was studying, the more I realized they were doing interesting things, that they were eating things that you wouldn't expect a peregrine in a city to be eating. It was eating things that you would expect to find in the countryside more and eating things that you would think, well, hold a minute here, that's quite a hard thing for a peregrine to catch during the day, such as a snipe or a woodcock or a teal duck or something like that. And so realized that they were hunting at night. And so gradually my relationship with the peregrine developed as I wanted to collect more data, as I wanted to find out more about them. And then as this kind of went on, really, I then started to ring peregrines. So in 2007, I started to, under a license, ring young peregrines when they're about 3 weeks old and put color identification rings on their legs. And that allowed me to then look at where these young peregrines were going when they left their nests. And that then involved a lot of media. So BBC Radio Bristol, BBC Springwatch, for example, were very interested in coming to film those occasions. And so that then gave me that kind of that opportunity then to show what we were doing on camera and develop those relationships with journalists. And then since then it's kind of just got more and more really. I just got to know more people. And what's amazing though is that back in 1998 I was kind of there were other people already studying urban peregrines, but it was a very small select group of people you could count on one hand. So I feel very privileged to have been there right at that kind of very cusp of when urban peregrines were just becoming urban. And now, I mean, almost every big city and town has urban peregrines, and it has either an individual person or a small group of people associated with it. So it's really amazing to have seen that kind of journey of urban peregrines over the last 2 decades.
Ed, what skills do raptor biologists need?
I think from a skill perspective, really, you've got those interpersonal skills, talking with people. When you're down in somewhere like Broadmead, where I was in Bristol when I was first studying peregrines, it was all about kind of liaising with local people, built people that were in the building, for example, to have permission to look for prey around the outskirts. When we're ringing peregrines, it's all about talking to local landowners and things like that. So there's lots of interpersonal skills, I think, being able to liaise with people, keeping people calm, getting them on your side, those sorts of things. And it's also a lot of raptor ecology and studying, I think, is working as part of a team as well. So I'm involved a lot with ringing peregrines, ringing goshawks, ringing owls. And I always say that it's a team effort. You're working with climbers, for example, who might be going down to nests, or people that are helping you to get up to nests and things like that. So I'd say a lot of the skill of being a raptor ecologist isn't necessarily about the birds themselves. It's actually the people skills. It's about talking with other people out of your team, but also people within your team, I think are really important. That aside, though, it's obviously really important to develop skills with identifying, what peregrines sound and look like, what goshawks look and sound like. So those field craft skills of actually knowing what these birds look like, sound like. And this is particularly important, I think, if you're going out under a Schedule 1 license, being able to actually look for the nests of these birds and knowing what to look for. And those sorts of things will either come by you being in the field naturally at places that might be public places where you can look and listen for these birds, or going out with other people who might be part of a raptor group who have the licenses and can sort of mentor you to actually develop those skills. So I think a lot of there's the field skill side of it, but there's the people side of it, the communication side of it that is also really important. I think the other thing is also a bit of resilience as well. So um, being able to not so much criticism, but more that raptors still get persecuted. There are still people out there who don't like raptors. So I don't get it very often, but you could be in a situation where someone might be challenging you about urban peregrines, about the fact that nest boxes are put on roofs to encourage peregrines, and somebody might be approaching me who might be a racing pigeon fancy and doesn't like the fact that racing pigeons are eaten by peregrines. So I think you need to also be able to communicate well, empathy, sympathy, things like that, but also still be able to hold your own position in whatever you might be stood with peregrines and things like that. So being resilient at if you do get also negative or confrontational kind of arguments or communications with people is really important.
Ed, for somebody who wants to do what you do, be a professional naturalist, uh, whether that be by, as we've already discussed, becoming a zookeeper or even becoming a broadcaster or an author, what should they wear for an interview with a curator at a zoo or with a potential publisher or commissioning editor?
Oh, yes, and really good question. And I think in the world of natural history and places like that, I think you still want to be smart, you still want to be looking very respectable. I'd say generally, I mean, I do a lot of sort of interviews for tenders and things like that, where I'm freelance wise going for things to do with conservation and nature and things like that. And generally, smart casual, I think is very acceptable these days. I wouldn't dream of necessarily wearing a smart shirt and tie. Although if I go to an interview that might be in person, more for an employer's job, say for example, so a number of years ago I went for a job interview at the Wildfowl Wetlands Trust, for example. I did wear a shirt and tie for that. So I kind of think it depends on the situation and the circumstances. I think generally for quite a lot of things these days, smart casual, kind of however I'm dressed now, is often very acceptable. But I think if you're a young person and you're just starting off, then actually I think wearing a shirt, wearing a tie, I think is still a way of showing that you're taking the job interview so very seriously. and that you have respect both for the job and the people that you're talking to. So it might just be because I'm a little bit older now. I get away with being smart casual a bit more. But I think certainly if you're a younger person and you're going for a more formal interview in person, I would certainly still suggest being smart, definitely, because I think it's all about the persona you're giving off. It's about the seriousness that you're taking with the job, even though in the job itself you may be wearing boots and outdoor coats and stuff like that. So I think it kind of depends on the job and where it might be, of course, but I would still say smart is still important, definitely.
And Ed, what are good questions that candidates for a job can ask?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking a little bit about sort of the good sort of questions. I think the sorts of questions really, I mean, I think interviewers want to see that you have an interest, obviously, in the job and what have you. And I think that people want to show potentially that you've got sort of a commitment to want to learn more. So I think you want to be asking questions about, what sort of opportunities are there, both within the job and maybe even beyond the job for you to get involved with raptors. It might be, for example, that you're going for a job that might be looking at, I don't know, let's say working with eagle owls, but you might be curious to see whether there's going to be opportunity to work with eagles or work with falcons and things like that. And what opportunity is there for you to extend your field knowledge beyond? So I think it's about showing that interest that you want to learn beyond the initial kind of job that you're doing, I think, those sorts of things. Um, and maybe whether, yeah, and also just exploring how open-minded perhaps the organization is for you to explore your own ideas, your own questions. It depends what it is, whether it might be research or public engagement. But I would say it's about questions that help the employer to see that you're curious, that you're interested, and that you perhaps want to extend your own learning. And I think all those sorts of questions will perhaps put you in better stead than somebody who simply just doesn't quite seem to be that interested or wanting to extend themselves, I think.
Mm, mm, mm. And your PhD, Ed, how did that come
Mm.
about? And congratulations, because you're on the verge of completing, aren't you?
I am. I've only got a couple of weeks and then I'm in. Well, when I first graduated, I did a degree in zoology at the University of Bristol. And when I first graduated, I didn't really want to carry on in academia at the time. It wasn't that I wasn't interested, but I think I'd had enough after sort of 3 years, and I wanted to get out there. And I went into sort of a career of kind of public engagement, really. I worked at Bristol Zoo, Bristol Museum, the University of Bristol, particularly with schools and families. And one thing that I realized, and I think this is quite important, is that despite the fact that I had 20 years of experience of engagement, I was unable to get a job in a university simply because I didn't have a master's or a PhD qualification. And that was quite gutting for me, particularly when you would see people who did have a master's or PhD in their early 20s with very little experience getting jobs. And I had 20 years worth of experience. And I was quite sort of glum about that. But one of my colleagues at university um, managed to kind of channel my positive energy into going for a master's and said, well, look, okay, we, that is the case. That is the situation. And, and that is the situation with obviously many universities that you do still need a postgraduate kind of qualification. So that's why I did my master's. I had the data, so I didn't have to collect the data. I had the data, and so I simply had to kind of analyze it and do it. And really, once I'd done the masters, I just thought, okay, well, I've got the masters. That's great. I can go for a teaching job in a university now if I want to. Not that I do at the moment. I'm quite enjoying my kind of freelance career that I have. But I felt that it would be a wasted opportunity if I didn't then carry on and do a PhD, which is almost like the equivalent of doing a master's, but three times over because it's, you have 3 or 4 chapters in your thesis. And I just thought that I'd regret not doing a PhD really if I didn't. And but again, I had the data. So I largely had all this kind of diet data over the last 20 years. And then thanks to COVID, I was then able to tap into lots of postgraduates and volunteers who were able to watch and study web cameras for me and get lots more data on what peregrines feed their young. And so over the last I've done it part time really. Over the last 5 years, I've been able to do this PhD, and it was affordable because I was able to do it part time really and pay for the tuition fees part time. So that's kind of how it came about. So when I do get this PhD, although it's not necessarily for a specific job or a specific reason, at least I've got it. I feel, it's a great achievement. And it means that, in my remaining kind of 20 years of my career left, I've got it for, if I do want to go back into academia or if I do need to get a job that is non-freelance.
Ed, what questions about peregrine conservation, particularly urban peregrine conservation, would you like to see answered in the next 5 years?
Well, I think studying peregrines is at a really exciting point, really, because we've got lots and lots of urban peregrines. We've got lots of web cameras on urban peregrines, but very few people actually doing anything with the data. So there's thousands and thousands of hours of data of urban peregrines, but because it's often being done by people who, are not professionally studying peregrines or doing them for academic studies, that data just gets lost. So I think there's an awful lot of I've obviously looked at particularly what the birds are feeding their young and what they're feeding and what have you. But I think there's lots of opportunities to look at the behavior of peregrines, right from the very start of laying their eggs all the way through to fledging young. And particularly what I would like to see is not just urban peregrines, but comparison with rural peregrines. Now that's a little bit more tricky because the technology involved is not quite as advanced. You're relying more on camera traps that have batteries, but the technology is improving all the time to get streaming footage from remote peregrine locations. Excuse me. So what I would like to see more now is how perhaps the diet and the behavior differs between rural dwelling peregrines that might be nesting on a rocky crag on a mountain and how that compares with good sample sizes with urban dwelling peregrines. The other thing I would love to see is something we've seen more and more of now, and I think it's a result of the higher density of peregrines, is we're seeing lots of birds called floaters. So these are non-breeding peregrines that are interacting with breeding peregrines. And in some cases, they're ousting the breeding females, they're fighting with them, they might even sometimes be killing the young of the peregrines and things like that. And we're seeing this more and more in the last 5 years. But again, there's nobody really studying that behavior, looking at how prevalent it is, and looking at actually kind of the results of it. I mean, we know it's happening, we're capturing it with web cameras, but I think there's real opportunity there for people to look at this. What happens when a peregrine population is doing well? We've been so used to kind of how peregrines just tick along when we've got a pair here and a pair there. But we're now seeing really interesting interactions where population density is high in urban locations. And so we're seeing quite a lot of behavioral changes with young birds wanting to nest earlier and ousting these kind of more mature birds. So I think there's a lot of really interesting behavioral studies that could be done um, in urban locations, but also studies that try and compare with rural peregrines so we can see what the difference is between those two kind of main habitat populations, I guess.
Ed, can you suggest a research topic for a student watching this?
Yeah, well, I think some of it touches on what I've just said. So I think a particular research topic could well be looking at the interactions of young birds that we call these floaters and how they are affecting the breeding success of established pairs. I think that could be a really, really good question to tap into all these different web cameras and footage and actually look at, you know, if and when those interactions are happening. And then when they are happening, actually kind of really studying what's going on, what the result is, whether the breeding female, for example, is getting ousted or whether she remains, and then what the result is of that. Does that mean that those eggs and chicks fail? Or does it, or do they have success? So I think that would be a really, really good thing to look at. That now we have a really good, healthy urban peregrine population. What is the effect of those floating birds coming in and interacting with those breeding birds?
What about the conference circuit, Ed? What conferences are there on birds of prey?
Yeah, well, I mean, globally, there is the Raptor Research Foundation. Now, they're based in North America, but they do have a kind of European committee and group, and certainly, I think in the next couple of years, we'll have a conference over this way as well. And you can, and wherever you are in the world, but if you're in Britain, you can also become a member. And the Raptor Research Foundation has a conference every year. This year it was in Costa Rica. Another year it'll be in another country, but as I say, they do have a European version as well. And if you're particularly interested in peregrines, then in 2027 there is going to be an international peregrine conference in Poland as well. That's just being put together, and details of that will be online. So that's something else to look out for. So those are the kind of main things to do with raptors, I think, the Raptor Research Foundation. But of course, the British House of Ornithology, the British Ornithologists Union in this country, although they focus very much on lots of different taxa of birds. Raptors, including peregrines, will also feature in some of the conferences that they do as well.
And Ed, what advice can you offer new entrants into raptor conservation? I mean, for example, you've done an awful lot of broadcasting. Should people be considering a short course in media, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one thing with raptors is that they are kind of very sexy birds. They've got forward-facing eyes. They're the sorts of birds that people love to learn about and love to see. So you've got that really amazing kind of public uh, joy for raptors, but then equally you do have that other side of it as well. You've got you've got this kind of slightly negative side where raptors in Britain are still persecuted, particularly in remote places where they're thought to be, feeding on grouse and pheasants and things like that. So I think that communication skills and developing your communication skills in how you can speak in plain English to people, to the public about raptors is really good, but also media as well. If you get called up to talk about a raptor species that you're studying, or for example, that there has been a case of persecuted birds, you want to be able to confidently get across what it is you want to say without kind of getting caught up or getting tripped up by the journalist or whoever might be asking the question. So I think definitely public engagement skills um, and media skills, I think, are definitely a good thing. And I would also say that, if you're still studying, get those experiences now before you have to earn money, before you have to go into a full-time job. Because I would say that that's when you've got the most opportunity to perhaps link up with local raptor groups. You've got the most opportunity maybe to tap into training that your university or your academic institution you might be with are offering those things for free. And also work experience, the opportunity to go and do work experience when you haven't, as I say, necessarily got to work full time. But I think things that are enabling you to learn more about those species, so whether you're working with a falconry organization, a zoo, or tapping into a raptor group, there's lots of raptor groups all around the UK where there's people going out and doing field surveys, you're doing ringing. So there's a real opportunity there for you to potentially tap in and go out for them and for real and actually see these raptors in the wild, potentially learn how to ring them, how to survey for them, how to learn the ring. So there's two sides there. There's the field side of it and looking at people, groups near where you might live that you can tap into. But then I think there's the communication side of it that I think is really important, both verbally speaking to people, but perhaps also writing as well. So I think developing your writing skills and being able to write in plain English without using AI, coherently and understanding the subject, I think is really important.
That's brilliant. Ed, is there anything that you'd like to add or any last minute advice for people?
Really, I think if you're interested in birds of prey, just enjoy them. Take the lead of what you feel passionate about and go forward with it. And, I think also don't always, you don't have to rely on other people. When I first started studying peregrines 25 years ago, that was me doing that off my own back. And although I had support from another ornithologist, it was me leading it. So, feel that there is still opportunity today with research, with birds, whatever it might be you're interested in, for you to lead, for you to allow your journey with that species or that group of species to lead the way. So, don't always feel that you've got to be led by other people, I think is a really important tip.
Mhm. Well, I'm going to jump ahead 2 weeks here and I'm going to say, Ed, you are a naturalist and guide specializing in peregrines. Thank you very much for being on the Practical Animal channel. Dr. Ed Drewitt.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Find yourself a perch. Nice.